All right, thank you for joining me today to discuss preventing and reporting abuse. We're going to get started. This should only take about 10 or 15 minutes, and hopefully you take away some information that will keep our students safe. So, to get started in Oregon, you are a mandatory reporter. Saturday Academy employees are mandatory reporters of child abuse and are required to immediately report suspected abuse to the Oregon Department of Human Services or to the DHS law enforcement agency in the area that you're working. And so when you make a report, you're going to want to collect a few pieces of information from the student. You want to know the name and address of the student, the name and address of the student's parents, the student's age, the type and extent of the abuse, including any previous evidence of abuse, the explanation given for the abuse, and then any other information that will help establish the cause of the abuse. Reports are required whenever an employee suspects a child that you come in contact with has suffered abuse. And so that's the only requirement, is that the employee suspects the child has been abused and has a reasonable suspicion. We'll define that in a little bit, that abuse has occurred. And so the Oregon law requires mandatory reporters to make an oral report by telephone or directly to the local law enforcement office. So if you are working in Multnomah County, that means you would contact the Multnomah County Sheriff's Office or the Portland Police Bureau. If you're working in Clackamas County, then you would obviously contact the Clackamas County Sheriff's Office. You could also contact the Oregon State Police, but there is a 1-800 reporting hotline, and I will get into details around that in a slide coming up. But before we go into actual reporting, let's talk about what is abuse. And so abuse comes in a lot of different forms, and even though there's many types of abuse, our response is always going to be the same. And so whether the abuse is neglect, whether it's physical abuse, sexual abuse, or threats and mental abuse, the result on our end is always the same. If we suspect that this abuse is going on, then we have to call the reporting hotline or the police. And that is called mandatory reporting. And so understand that child abuse is anything that causes physical or mental injury to a child that is not accidental and that endangers the welfare or the safety of a child. This includes things like assault, cruelty that impacts mental functioning, rape, sexual exploitation, negligence, threats of harm, things like allowing methamphetamine manufacturing around a minor or unlawful exposure to controlled substances. So there's a lot of different forms of abuse, and all of them should be reported. And so if you are working with students, some of the signs that you want to keep an eye out for, obviously it's going to be things like physical injuries, any kind of visible neglect. If the kid shows up in the middle of winter and doesn't have socks and shoes and a jacket on, those kind of things. Malnourishment, if their teeth are rotten, if they have lengthy unexplained absences, if you hear a child is being left home alone and they're under 10 years old, if a child's always asking for food, if they have severe mood changes, if they're afraid to leave camp and go home, if they have issues with the bathroom. These are all warning signs. It doesn't necessarily mean abuse is occurring, but these are warning signs that you might want to pay closer attention and that you might want to have your radar up. Now, when we talk about reasonable suspicion and how you decide when to report, reasonable suspicion means that the reporting party has reasonable belief, given all of the circumstances and based upon all of the specific and describable facts, that the child's situation is a result of abuse. And so if you're interacting with a child and you have a reasonable belief that they're being abused, you are a mandatory reporter and you have to call that into the hotline. All right, so to get a little deeper into the different types of abuse, when we talk about physical abuse, what we're really talking about is any assault as defined by the Oregon rules of any child any kind of physical injury to a child that has been caused by anything other than accidental means. So if a child gets hurt and it's anything other than an accident, that could potentially be abuse. And so if you hear about injuries that are unexplainable, if you hear about injuries that don't seem to be accidents, then that should be considered abuse and should be reported. Also note that involuntary seclusion of a child or a young adult who is getting services from Saturday Academy is also considered abuse. And so please do not seclude your kids as a form of discipline if they're acting up. And so physical abuse is obviously reportable in all instances, as is sexual abuse. And so sexual abuse is going to be defined as rape, unlawful penetration, incest, sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, exposing minors to explicit material or language, and any kind of sexual contact between a minor and an adult. And so there's a lot that goes into each one of these bullet points, but just understand that as a whole, sexual abuse is reportable, and if you have any information that a child is suffering at the hands of adults, then that should be reported to the hotline. One of the next areas that's reportable is going to be mental injury or threats to children. And so really any mental injury to a child, which includes observable and substantial impairment to the child's mental or psychological ability to function, could be considered a reportable instance. And so being cruel to a child could be reportable, as long as you are thinking about the culture that the child is from and what is appropriate for that culture. Also know that threatening harm to a child is a reportable instance. So if your harm results in subjecting the child to substantial risk, then that is a reportable instance. So verbal abuse is kind of in this umbrella here. Verbal abuse includes threatening, significant physical or emotional harm to a child, harassment, coercion, threats, intimidation, humiliation, mental cruelty, inappropriate sexual comments, insults, all of those kind of things could fall under this domain here. And so just be aware that mental injury and threats is also a reportable instance. And now this is not going to be peer-to-peer threats. That's handled a different way. This is really adults threatening kids. And so that's what we're talking about when we look at reportable instances. So if you do suspect abuse is occurring with the students that you're working with, or any student that you come across, whether it's in your line of work with Saturday Academy or not, you are mandatory reporters for child abuse in the state of Oregon now, whether you're on the clock, whether you're off the clock, whether you're exposed to the kid in the Saturday Academy program, or whether you're just walking down the street. You have a big responsibility now. And so the reporting hotline number, I want everybody to put this into their cell phones. It's 855-503-7233. If you have this in your cell phone, then you're prepared to make a report immediately upon any kind of suspicion of abuse or neglect. And remember that even if you report abuse to a manager or to a school employee, you are still required to call the hotline and make a report to the hotline. Reporting to your supervisor does not meet the requirements of the law. And so there are instances where people are getting punished because they told their supervisor, but then they didn't report it to the hotline, and the supervisor never reported it to the hotline, and then the kid goes home and has to suffer with abuse. And so make sure that in the end, even if you report it to a manager, you still call the hotline and report it to the hotline. After you've reported it to the hotline, you are also required to report it to your Saturday Academy manager. You can also call your manager before making the report and have a conversation with them as well. But in short, you report it and you talk to your manager. So let's say a kid does come to you and say that they've been abused, or you learn that they've been abused, how do you respond to these kids? That's an emotional conversation, and the kids are trusting you if they've come up to you and shared this information. And so the first thing that you need to do is to understand that you have to tell the child that you believe them and that you're going to contact the people who can help them. And so you don't have to start digging around for details. All you need is that reasonable suspicion. And if you have that reasonable suspicion, then you can make the report. So, you don't have to interview the kid. The kid is going to end up telling their story in detail later to professionals. And so be there, be supportive, be caring, listen, document, and write down what the student says to you, and then make your report. So always keep your kids' safety in mind. If they've reported abuse to you, don't release them back home to where that abuse is occurring. If you have to call 911, then call 911, but don't release the kid back. So, some common questions that people have when they start talking about mandatory reporting, will my report be confidential? Do I have to give them my name? And so the reporter's identity will remain confidential to the full extent allowable by law. However, if court action is initiated, you may be called on to be a witness, and the court may order that your name be disclosed. And so, minus a court order or being involved in a court case, then you would be protected and your identity would be protected. So if you call and report abuse because your neighbor is abusing their kid, they don't say, your neighbor called us and reported that you're abusing your kid. So be aware that you are protected, and your confidentiality is protected as much as it can be. Likewise, can you be sued for making a report, whether it's a false report or a true report? The answer is no. Oregon law provides that anyone who makes a good faith report is protected, and so you don't have to worry about being sued. If you don't report child abuse, not only are you risking the child and sending the child back into a place where abuse may be happening, but you could also be penalized up to $2,000. It's a Class A violation, and it carries a maximum penalty of $2,000 if you are given information and you fail to report it. What happens after I report? And so you call the hotline or you call the police and you make your report. Basically, Child Protective Services will follow up, and they have this whole process that they go through. And so they have decision points along the way, and basically they start going through the process and identifying, is this an actualized incident that needs to be investigated, and is it likely abuse? And they kind of go through their process. And so if you've made a report and CPS needs more information, they could potentially reach out to you, but this is handled by a caseworker and it is not your responsibility. So the other question people get is, do you have to report out-of-state abuse? So you're an Oregon mandatory reporter. If you're in Washington, are you required to report abuse there? Oregon law is kind of unclear around this, and so my suggestion would be absolutely report abuse regardless of where you are if you suspect that it's happening. But Oregon law is kind of unclear on whether you have to report out-of-state abuse and how you do that. And so if you witness an incident of child abuse, or if a child comes to you and you're out of state, make sure that you call the local child welfare office or the local police department and notify them and let them do their job. All right, and so if you want some more information, the Department of Human Services has some information on their website, and they also have a video that's about 25 minutes long that provides a lot of detailed information around mandatory reporting in the state of Oregon. And so make sure that if you want to pursue some more information, you can use these links here and go learn some more. Just want to remind you that upon making a report, that you should also notify Saturday Academy Management that you've made a report, and you should fill out a incident report and submit that. So all in all, It is going to be your responsibility to keep kids safe, and um, it is a huge responsibility, and we take it very seriously at Saturday Academy. And so just make sure that you understand your role as a mandatory reporter, you understand your role as an in loco parent who has responsibility for the kids, and just understand that if you have a reasonable suspicion that a child has been abused, you need to act and do something about that suspicion. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to the operations team or to the classes management team, and we can get you some more information around this. And if you have any ideas on how to improve this experience for future employees, please let us know. Have a great day.